I have the distinct honor to be the Executive Director of the ALS Association Greater Philadelphia Chapter. The Help and Hope Symposium, which took place a few weeks ago, was our first virtual experience in providing pre-recorded educational information to our many constituents, and turned out to be a phenomenal success. There have been more than 5,000 views of symposium elements, and still counting. So as we're all learning in this new environment, we no longer need to feel as if we've missed out on an online opportunity, since there's usually a chance to later view a recording of it. And today is no exception. There are folks who could not attend today's reception, but we'll be sure to send them the recorded version of today's activity. So this promises to be a truly special experience for you, in as much as it is both live and interactive. And how lucky we are that the three ALS researchers, hopefully Jinsey will join us, who presented at the symposium, are able to be back with us today to answer your questions about ALS research. And to introduce our distinguished speakers, it's my pleasure to now introduce Ellen Phillips, who likely needs no introduction. Ellen is currently the board chair of the chapter, but as most, if not all of you know, Ellen has been the driving force of this organization for pretty much most of her entire adult life. So Ellen, at this point, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and congratulations on your 1-year anniversary as our executive director.
Thank you.
We appreciate you. I'm not sure if all of you participated in the Help and Hope Symposium that, as Jeff just said, we had a few weeks ago. The response to that was excellent, and as Jeff said, we look to duplicate the VIP reception that we did last year in person, and that went well, and I have no fears that everything will go smoothly today. And hopefully Jinsey will join us. If there's some way we can alert Karen to contact Jinsey, that would be great. So our speakers, the great thing about this is the speakers who were on the Help and Hope Symposium have made a return to, it's a double header. Since we don't have baseball, we might as well use those metaphors here because they're not going to be used. So we have with us Zach Simmons, a pillar of the clinical, of our clinical clinics. He's, as most of you know, professor of neurology and humanities at Penn State, Penn State's Hershey's Medical Center, and co-founder of our center over 20 years ago. And Zach's been great in so many areas, and one of them is helping to guide this symposium from the start. When I needed someone to bounce the whole concept off of, Zach has been just absolutely terrific. Our second speaker is Brian Traynor. He's an MD, PhD. Zach is an MD. Zach, are you working on that PhD? Sorry, that was a joke. You know what, but Brian is a senior investigator at NIH's National Institute of Aging. And he has been known to the ALS community for a very long time. He's also adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins. So he brings many different ways of connecting with our organization. And I've known both Brian and Zach for a very long time. Jinsey, I'm hopeful she will join us, is an MD with, oh, you're here?
I'm here.
There, okay, you're just getting perfect timing, great time for your introduction. Excellent, you knew that was coming.
You bet.
Jinsey is an MD and an MSc. She's assistant professor of neurology at Columbia University, and she serves as the director of neuromuscular clinical trials. That's the 3 today. We've received a number of questions. There's also ways for us to have dialogue during this 1 hour and counting reception, as we're calling it. So Tony, do you have any housekeeping rules that you'd like to impart?
So thank you, Ellen. I apologize if my eyes aren't on the screen. I'm using a new webcam. So we have email questions that have already been sent to us from people who are on this call already. I'm going to mute everybody aside from our researchers and ask that you stay muted just to keep out any background noise. I will, if you have other questions or follow-ups to the discussions, please put them in the group chat, which you can see by going to the bottom of your Zoom and clicking chat. You can put in your questions there and ask. If your question is not answered today, we will follow up with our researchers by email. If you have follow-up questions from this and you are interested, we'll do that as well. But we will start with some of the questions that were sent to us already, and we're going to hope to get as many as possible from all the researchers. So with that, Ellen, do you want the researchers to just give a brief reading?
Sure. We'll have a brief greeting from Zach Simmons, Brian Traynor, and Jinsey Andrews. Zach, would you like to go first?
Sure. So thank you for inviting me here. This is it's an honor, and really I enjoy very much having an opportunity to speak to a group that's so invested in ALS care and in ALS research. What I do here in my current position is I oversee a clinical center and a clinical research center, and we've had a long-standing interest in looking at ALS quality of life. We've been heavily invested in the use of telemedicine, even more so since, of course, the whole COVID pandemic hit, but we were looking at it quite a bit before then, and we're involved in a number of clinical trials. What I spoke about during the initial session of Help and Hope was the platform studies, and I'm happy to answer questions either relating to that or to other items that that any of you may care to ask. So thank you.
Brian, you want to go next?
Sure. So thank you very much for the invitation to come back and to give the initial talk. I enjoyed putting it together. It was an unusual scenario whereby kind of talking into the computer and you don't actually see people's reactions in the audience. So I think that this follow-up meeting here is a great opportunity to really sort of connect back to those of you who are listening to this. I mean, that's the whole idea. We want to try and answer any of the questions that you may have. And also to try and impart a sense of the dynamic sort of research that's ongoing in the ALS world at the present time. I think maybe I'm speaking on behalf of Jinsey and Zach a little bit, but I think if you go back 20 years and compare the amount of research that was done then compared to now, I think that it's really been exponential. And I think that in large part, that's due to the driving force of the various associations and the various patient groups. And they've been instrumental in driving that forward and really sort of bringing ALS into the sort of the eye of the community, so that we know that this is a disease that we really need to go after. So I genuinely think that we are at a very exciting time in ALS research. I think that there are real discoveries being made every day, and not just esoteric ones, but ones that can have lasting impact, hopefully good impact, beneficial impact on patients' lives. So I'll pause there. I'm actually kind of really looking forward to hearing some of the questions and trying to answer them, and also from Jinsey and from Zach.
And I'm Jinsey Andrews. I share much of the sentiment that Brian just shared. I apologize for the wobbly video and a little bit of a late entry. I am, as you know, based out of Columbia University. I'm the director of neuromuscular clinical trials. I spend almost feels like 100%, I'm supposed to be 50%, doing clinical trials and experimental therapeutics. So today we are dosing a patient with experimental therapy. So I'm toggling that, but wanted to be here to be available to answer questions. I also spend half my time in clinic, taking care of people living with the disease and going through this journey. I'm very grateful to be in the company of Zach and Brian to join you today. And I want to just thank Ellen and the ALS Association for having this session, because I have to echo Brian's comment about giving a presentation and putting it together without an audience and no questions, because I really like to vibe off, everyone's kind of feelings and sentiments and what they're actually interested in talking about, rather than just giving a flat out presentation. So I'll keep it short and sweet. We can get right to the nitty gritty.
Great. Now, thank you for the introductions. I'm going to start with the first question that I think is pertinent to what's going on today, and any of you can start. This comes from Ellen Phillips, and the question is, with most, maybe all clinical trials stopped or paused during the COVID-19 pandemic, how does that affect results? Some people may have declined or improved or stayed the same, and some of the trials may be over by now. How does the FDA or anyone else account for this lapse in time?
I think I might be the best suited to kind of go first, and everyone else can join in. Yes? I'll just jump right in. So I think the COVID-19 probably impacted the startup of some trials. But many patients who were enrolled in clinical trials and were actively in the middle of it, for the most part, I can speak specifically to the New York City experience, we were able to continue in some capacity. So that means during the peak times, we had to ensure safety of both people living with the disease and their family and also the staff, but we were able to continue dosing in a limited fashion, so we might not have gotten all the data, but we were able to collect some critical key elements to continue the trials that were ongoing for our participants. Now, there are some studies that for us, we were right about to start, and for those studies, new enrollment were paused, and some of our observational studies that required in-person clinic visits were paused. So I think when we talk about observational studies meaning we're trying to find, taking samples or either blood or spinal fluid or urine, or understanding clinical progression of disease. That kind of data is quite important in understanding the natural progression of disease, the variability of disease. And so those had some delays, but they weren't stopped completely, just some of the data might be delayed, I think is the best way to put it. And the new trials, as I said, new enrollment was paused at our site, but we are in the process of reopening. And some of the studies, like the platform trials, which Zach can comment on, made adjustments. I mean, it allowed us to look at the way we do clinical trials and make adjustments that allow for a reduction of the burden of participating in clinical trials. So that includes remote assessments, remote consenting, remote testing for safety, whichever that may be. It could be lab or blood testing or EKG for heart testing, and reducing the need for people to come to the site. So many of the trials going forward have allowed for flexibility of the frequency of visits or the need for in-person interactions for assessments, but allow for us to collect data that could be of scientific rigor to answer whether some intervention or investigational therapy is effective. So in that way, COVID-19 delayed some parts of it, but likely contributed to making things better for clinical trials as a whole in ALS. That's my perspective.
So, thank you. I agree with all of the points really that Jinsey made. I think that what we saw here was that as Jinsey just said, we had a halt to enrollment of new patients for a brief time, although we were then permitted to resume what we call interventional studies here, which means any studies that involve giving of a drug. So for clinical trials, our pause in terms of doing that was actually very brief in terms of enrolling new patients. The challenge was follow-up visits for patients who were already enrolled. We were permitted to continue doing those as long as the visit couldn't be done remotely, meaning that there was no information that could be collected through telephone or through video. And so we were able to continue those. And so it's varied a great deal from site to site, depending upon what the local regulations were and the institutional regulations were. Certainly, we've at this point restarted we've restarted seeing patients on a regular basis for our interventional studies, but as Jinsey pointed out, many trials in general have been put on hold at this point. The platform trial, which many of us are involved in, has been doing a great deal of work behind the scenes in order to figure out how to restart and how to do so in such a way that people are put at least risk when they come in. So how can you minimize the number of visits that people have to attend in person? How can you collect the maximal amount of data remotely? And then, of course, at each individual institution, there are certain precautions that everybody is taking in order to maximize safety of the individual participants. The goal at this point for the platform trial would be to get it up and going. So I'm told by the folks at MGH, and Jinsey may have as good or better a feel for this than me, but hopefully next month. At that point, depending on individual institutional guidelines and regulations, enrollment would restart again. And so it's been very similar, that we've seen a pause, but then a resumption in doing these studies. Similar to what's happened at Columbia, we've not been able to do observational studies, meaning studies where we're not giving drugs, unless the patient is also coming in for an ALS clinic visit. And we just started over the last week or two re-seeing ALS patients in person rather than seeing them via telemedicine or speaking with them via telephone. So things are gradually gearing back up again. One of the questions that was asked was, how does the FDA account for the lapse in time and what's going to happen to the timeline for all of these trials? And I think that of course, acquisition of results is going to be pushed back simply because the initial visits were delayed some, and there are still some studies that at this point haven't given the go-ahead to start enrolling again. But I think that we're at a point now where we'll see everything with appropriate safety measures put in place, gearing back up again. So there will certainly have been a lapse, but I don't think that the lapse is one that's going to be going on for a great deal of time more.
Great. I have a question that came up from Patty Lake Quinn that is a follow-up to this, so I think it makes sense to ask now. How would you respond to people who feel ALS research is proceeding too slowly and they might want their donations to go elsewhere based on whether COVID or otherwise?
All of us are reluctant to grab that one. So.
No, I can go for it. Why not? I'm a New Yorker. I'm fearless. Why not?
And you're still there.
Yeah, right. Well, here's the deal. I think that when that perception comes, and I can empathize with it because, when you're watching the news and as COVID-19 unfolds before your eyes and you see all these trials and the response from the FDA, it seems like when this pandemic occurred, FDA seemed to react very quickly and trials got off the ground very quickly. And many people living with the disease, and even as a clinical trialist, it was a little frustrating to know that, ALS is just as serious and is still continuing despite the COVID pandemic. But the response from FDA seems slower compared to that. But regardless, I think this is where it's very important to know that even though the research seemed like it was on pause. There was a lot of activity going on in the background, which I now realize didn't seem, and this is why I think this kind of a session is really important. There was a lot of activity happening behind the scenes in terms of clinical trialists and researchers collaborating to keep things moving forward. So despite the pause in in-person interactions, I think it was important to know that some new projects came out of this whole time period when things seemed like they were stopped. And that includes analyzing big data from big repositories and new collaborations and even new drugs to enter into the ALS clinical pipeline, so clinical trial pipeline. So even in that time period, just in the 2 months, probably I interacted with 6 companies that want to enter into the ALS space to do clinical trials because they have a compound that's scientifically rational and is a good fit for possibly having a meaningful impact on ALS. So in that way, in order for them to enter into human clinical trials, the FDA has to give them the okay. And so I think in that regard, it's never fast enough, right? We're always running a race against ALS. But I think in that way, there is a lot of movement, but I don't think it's always so obvious because we don't get the exposure as an ALS community like people like COVID-19 had and cardiovascular disease and breast cancer. So in my mind, I think that it's very, it is true, it can always move faster. And I think the advocacy from people in the community, that also includes people living with the disease, their caregivers, advocacy groups like the ALS Association, even clinical trialists and industry partners, all coming together and changing the landscape. It's shifting and changing as we speak. I mentioned a little bit about it in the talk, but the new draft drug development guidelines and new bills that have been introduced kind of demonstrate that there is momentum here. And so this is why it's important to continue that momentum, because once you have that one step, you got to keep pushing forward to make that change. And every individual has that ability to make that change.
So I want to echo a little bit of what Zach and Jinsey have been saying. And I think they're absolutely right. I do also think, though, that there are opportunities that arise from the chaos. So never let a good problem go to waste, good issue go to waste. So in particular, I think that what we have seen over the last number of months is that telemedicine, which Zach has been quite prominent in, and even more importantly, remote sensing, is a way, it's an avenue that we can use to collect data on our patients. And this is really important, I think, in the ALS sphere for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, I think that one of the issues that we encounter with ALS patients in trials is that there is a significant drop-off over time. So we actually have to enroll, if we want 100 patients at the end of our trial, we actually have to enroll 200 patients at the beginning, because we expect a significant attrition of patients over time. And that is predominantly because these patients find it very difficult to travel. It also means that we tend to, when we're enrolling patients, we tend to take them from local regions so that they're closer by. It makes the travel to the medical center easier. But by using remote sensing and by using telemedicine, it means that you're removing that burden from patients. It also means that rural areas and underserved areas, now you can start enrolling patients in from those regions as well. I think that what's going to end up happening in the longer term is, through the use of that, we're going to decrease the number of patients that we have to enroll in our trials. And because we're collecting information continuously over the day and not just every 3 months at a 1-hour visit, it also means that we're going to be able to shorten our clinical trials. So ultimately, what will happen is we will have the ability to do more clinical trials over time. So I think that there are opportunities here that if we can see them and we can leverage them, we can actually use them in the future for making progress, better progress in ALS clinical trials and clinical care.
I would like to echo and I'd expand on that a bit. So I'm going to delve into the realm of philosophy a little bit, but it is indeed, I think, for those of us who work in the field and certainly for our patients and their caregivers, it can seem frustratingly slow. I mean, after all, riluzole was approved more than 20 years ago, and here we are today with with only one other approved drug to treat ALS itself and another to treat pseudobulbar affect. But if you look at the nature of the diseases that we're treating, neurodegenerative disorders are a tough group to treat, both in terms of our understanding of the processes that are going on and our ability to have the tools at the level of sophistication needed to really address those properly. If you look at the neurodegenerative disorders, ALS, Alzheimer's disease, for example, other dementias, it's not a lack of money and not a lack of researchers. There's an enormous amount of money that goes into Alzheimer's disease research, and yet, as almost all of you probably have had to some degree or another a personal experience with, we don't have a cure or even a way to effectively slow Alzheimer's progression at this point. So actually addressing a neurodegenerative disorder is a very complex problem requiring people at many levels, people doing clinical trials such as GINSI, people doing detailed genetic and other basic science like Brian and his colleagues, and it is simply by its nature a slow process because it is so complex. The types of problems that medicine has traditionally been very good at solving quickly and sort of taking a let's fix this approach have been infectious diseases, HIV, vaccinations. These things happen relatively effectively. Mechanical problems such as a lot of cardiology, replacing a heart, bypassing a vessel, that sort of thing. Orthopedics, replacing a shoulder. But when it comes to neurodegenerative disorders, these are problems that just take a lot of time and a lot of effort by a number of people. And as Jinsi said, there's been a great deal of work, an enormous amount of work going on behind the scenes, even when things seem to be paused. And so I think it reflects not a lack of movement forward, but just the nature of the process.
Wonderful. We have a question from one of the people who participated in the Help and Hope Symposium, Christine Moretti. She asked a few questions related to PLS, which I'm sure you are all familiar with. And just to condense them a bit, is there PLS-specific research in the pipeline, and why is PLS included in some studies and not others? And also, will PLS patients eventually be included in platform trials? Also, there's a follow-up to that, but I will put those first so to not ask too many questions at once.
So maybe I can take the PLS clinical trials and why, if there are any, and why are they not included in some other trials, and maybe I can defer the PLS being included in platform trials. I can ask Zach to help with that one. And if Brian has any other comments, you can add on. So I think I'll just start with PLS. There is a clinical trial that has been ongoing, and it is targeting the walking speed, since PLS can affect the speed at which people walk because of spasticity or stiffness of their muscles. Other than that, there aren't many PLS clinical trials specific to that particular form of the disease. And it's tough because it affects far fewer people than ALS. And there is still a lot of unknowns. So although many of us are frustrated that we don't have a cure for ALS, we know a lot less for PLS, primary lateral sclerosis. In some clinical trials, PLS has a different rate of progression than ALS, and sometimes presents itself differently than ALS. And so if there's a specific investigational drug that's targeting a mechanism that we think might be happening in ALS, it might not necessarily be relevant in PLS. And the other aspect is that if you grouped everybody together, sometimes if you're looking for an effect, if everybody's very, very different, say we're looking for walking speed, it might be difficult to see the effect of a drug on people with PLS and ALS all grouped together because there's such variability of how fast they progress. And then it might even mask the effect of, or the true effect of a particular investigational drug. So there are some trials that do include PLS and ALS because there might be a similar symptom or a similar mechanism that might be impacted by whatever therapy or device or intervention might be tested. So a lot of the inclusion of PLS or not including PLS is driven by whatever the mechanism is of the device or the investigational therapy and what it's anticipated to do. I think that's just scratching the surface. I don't know if Brian wants to add anything or Zach wants to add about the platform trial.
No, I would say with respect to the platform trial, I'm not aware right now of an immediate plan to add PLS to the platform trial. The one reason is what Jinsey just said, which is that when we attempt to do clinical trials, we try to the degree we can to put people in who look similar, thinking that maybe the underlying disease process in those people is similar enough that they would all respond or have some response to the same drug. And when we add PLS into a trial, we risk adding people who appear to have a different sort of process going on. It's a much slower process. It doesn't affect lower motor neurons. And by making the group more heterogeneous, it may mask some benefits that we might see in a subset of people who wouldn't be PLS patients, for example. That doesn't mean that treatment isn't needed. In fact, there was a session that was held last year, just before the American Academy, not this past year, but 2019, just before the American Academy of Neurology meeting by Dr. Mitsumoto from Columbia, which was specifically done to address PLS, and in particular, one of the things he's been looking at is, do you simply need a different measuring tool to assess how people with PLS are doing? Because if you use the one that we use for ALS, the ALS functional rating scale score, it changes so slowly over time that you'd have to have a clinical trial lasting years to see a benefit if what it did was slow the disease rather than actually reverse the disease. So what we need is better ways to measure small changes in addition to drugs that might be tailored specifically. Brian may have other comments.
Yeah, I don't really have a comment about PLS. I have a more general comment about rate of progression and neurodegeneration. And it alludes back to something that Zach said earlier, which is that neurodegeneration as a field has proven to be really difficult to crack. I mean, I do think we're making progress, but in terms of actionable items and drugs that we can bring forward to the clinic, maybe not so much. The reason why I bring this up is because we are talking to a group of people who are very active as advocates for ALS research. And one of the points I always like to try and get across is that when you're talking to people and you're advocating on behalf of ALS, it is always worth making the point. Generally speaking, you're talking to funders and people who have access to the resources that decide where those resources go. It is worth making the point that ALS, among all of the pantheon of neurodegenerative diseases, is probably one of the best to go after at the beginning. And the reason for this is, unfortunately, because ALS is rapidly progressive. And therefore, you get that readout of whether your drug is working that much quicker. So in contrast, if you were to do that for Alzheimer's disease, because Alzheimer's is really quite a long drawn out process, and the same goes for Parkinson's disease, again, quite long drawn out. you would actually have to do your trial for a longer, much longer period of time, maybe 10 years, in order to actually see a beneficial outcome. So having ALS as sort of the model that we can sort of bring forth to the funders and to those who control the resources to say, look, this is a disease we really should be going after because it could pave the way for all of these other neurodegenerative diseases. I think that's a worthwhile point to make.
Thank you. Again, for anyone participating, if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat room and we will get to them time permitting. The next questions are really specified to you, Dr. Trainer, but to everybody from Regina Ernest. Do you researchers think a genetic test is something that we should develop? And if you have somebody in your family with ALS, or you know someone in their family with ALS, what is their experience with family members? Do family members want to know? And would there be a benefit to knowing? It's a controversial topic, and truthfully, many people don't know how they would feel about it.
Okay, so that is a huge area. There are books, if not libraries, written about this entire topic. So it is. I don't think we can delve into it in much detail here, but let's just give some very broad answers. Are there genetic testing? Is genetic testing available for ALS? The answer is yes, there is. Are we capable of identifying the genetic cause in every single patient? No, absolutely not. So and Zach and Jinsey and myself, when we see our patients, we divide them into two categories. We divide those into patients who report a family history of ALS, so-called familial ALS. Within that group, we generally can find the gene, I'd say, in about 2/3 of times, 2/3 of cases. On the much more common sporadic type of disease, I think that we can only find the gene in about 10% of cases, and most times that actually is C9orf72, that repeat expansion. So those tests are available. I will tell you that the ALS Association and others have actually really done sterling work in this regard. They've set up a mechanism along with Jennifer Rogenbach and Jonathan Glass at Emory, whereby they can actually pay for the genetic testing in familial cases if that individual cannot, their insurance company or for whatever reason cannot pay for it. So that's one point to make. The second one sort of alluded to whether we should be collecting DNA samples. I think that's what they were asking, whether we should be collecting DNA samples in everybody. My humble opinion, and I'm sure Zach will smile at this and Ellen will smile at this, it's something I've been advocating for 10 years and I'm always chasing after Zach looking for DNA samples. So the answer is yes. And in part that is because genetics is a numbers game. The more numbers you have, the more likely you are to be able to find that little nugget of gold that you're looking for. So it's a broad and complex area. There was another question about how family members react. I think that like in everything in human nature, you can divide them into two camps. I think that you have those who do not want to know, and that's quite a reasonable approach. And then there are those who really want to know, and that's quite a reasonable approach as well. I think that where we run into difficulty sometimes is when we have one member who wants to know for themselves, but they want everybody else in the family to also know what their status is. And of course, not everybody in the family will be as comfortable with that. And of course, sometimes we have to mediate that, and we have to kind of go, well, look, it's everybody has to make that decision for themselves. You can't enforce your opinion on them. And it's really not a one-size-fits-all approach that works here. We have to be adaptable and we have to be flexible. So I hope that that's kind of covered some of those areas that were asked in very general terms.
I can maybe just add a little bit. In addition, it's very true. It's very individual for family members who have someone they love with ALS, the decisions. So I just wanted to add that we follow patients with gene mutations here at Columbia, but we have a program where we follow family members who do not have any symptoms follow them and if they choose to do so. So they sign an informed consent and they volunteer. And it's pretty surprising to see that most people want to be involved in some way, whether it is participating in a program like that or just knowing or advocating for ALS. And there are, as Brian mentioned, ways for people, if they prefer to know versus not knowing, and participating in programs like that. So as Brian mentioned, there are genetic tests available. They're commercially available. They're for most of the genes. And I should also add that there are clinical trials in early phase clinical development for some of the more common genes, which are the C9orf72 and the SOD1 mutations, but not all the genes. So, we're in early days right now.
The only other thing I would add, because it's been covered so well by both Jinsey and Brian, is that when we really, there's been, at least from what I've seen over the last few years, a real change in terms of people asking about genetic testing and in terms of our doing it. So one of the main drivers for us now offering genetic testing to everybody that I see with ALS is the fact that there are, as Jinsey just said, clinical trials starting up that are gene-based for SOD1 and for C9orf72 and presumably in the future perhaps for others as well. And people are just much more familiar with and comfortable with the fact that genetic information is relatively easy to obtain. People see things for 23andMe or and similar commercial services, and they realize that that genetic testing overall is not something that's sort of way out there and costs millions of dollars. It's much more mainstream than it was, but it really does have to be couched in careful counseling and a real eyes open sort of approach to the fact that people just see the need for genetic information much differently, and a real need to respect the fact that that just because a person thinks that everybody in their family should know their genetic status and the genetic status of everybody else, as Brian said, doesn't mean that other people in the family will think that, and often there's a real difference in that. If you look at another model that we have good data for, Huntington's disease, which we've known the genetics of for a long time, and you ask how many people, given the opportunity to be tested for Huntington's disease and knowing that they're at risk, how many people actually say, yeah, sure, go ahead and test me? It's less than half.
So I'm glad that you are on the screen now, Dr. Simmons, because our next questions come from Michael and Barbara Arning. First of all, they like the concept of the platform design, and they wanted to know, are there any results yet, and what new studies or might be leading to treatments or that you think? And also, Michael Arning suggests it would be good at science conferences to look back at the previous year. Can you explain, any of you explain, how far ALS research has advanced in the last year? Are we seeing a growth in progress, or are things moving at the same pace?
Sure. So all of those are good questions, of course. So I think from the platform perspective, right now where that is that the studies, the platform trial itself has not yet gotten underway. So there's no data on the 3 drugs that are being tried, other than the earlier phase information that led to a belief that those drugs will have a high probability of being effective in ALS, and therefore are worth trying as ways to try to slow disease progress. But there's certainly no phase 2 data, which is the current phase of the platform study, about how those how those drugs do or do not work. And I'm sorry, Tony, could you repeat the last part of that question again?
Certainly, and this is for everybody. Michael Arning suggested it would be good at each science conference to look back at the previous year, and we wanted to ask, how much has ALS research advanced in the last year? are we seeing a growth in progress, or are things moving at the same pace so that donors and patients and relatives can see what's been accomplished?
Yeah, and so I'm going to defer a lot of that to Brian and Jinsey, but I will say that at the large international ALS MND symposium that's held every year around December, there is really always one can always get a good cumulative view of what's going on, because the studies that are announced inevitably build upon past studies. And it's we've always commented year after year that the growth in research and the growth in understanding of the disease and the growth in the number of discoveries in the basic science piece of that conference has always been enormous. What's been slower over the years is the translation of that enormous growth in knowledge to focused clinical trials and to drugs. And I really see that as changing a great deal, because there are so many more drugs in play right now. But I'll defer the rest to my colleagues.
I can just jump in. And so I think, it's funny that this question came up because, for the first time, the American Academy of Neurology, which is not ALS specific, had a year in review plenary session. And they choose a couple of disease states or disease indications for the closing session. And in 2019, they chose ALS as one of the 6 indications that had the greatest change to be highlighted as a year in review. And it's remarkable. The last year has been fairly pivotal in that the drug development guidelines from the FDA were finalized, and concurrently the ALS clinical trial guidelines, that was an international effort with international stakeholders, were also published last year in 2019. But what's really stemmed from that is the clinical research community looking together with people living with the disease and caregivers and having their perspective in designing clinical trials moving forward. And so in that way, the platform trial is one innovation in clinical trial design, but trying to improve those designs to meet some of the new goals that have been established from the community, which include trying to reduce people's times or exposures on placebo, trying to understand efficacy of a drug at a much faster time than 18 months or 12 months, and trying to improve access for all people who are interested in trying investigational drugs and understanding what mechanisms exist. So in that way, I think the field is shifting and moving rapidly. And these are things that have always been there. Like, for example, the interest in stem cells as a potential investigational treatment in ALS. Since I started in 2005, I've had people living with the disease ask me about. But this year and last year, we finally have a phase 3 stem cell study to help us understand how that impacts the disease. So I think in that way, it's picked up pace. And I think this is my segue to you, Brian. The biggest change that you can see, like literally, if you go to Brian's presentation, I watched it, Brian, the number of genes that we're discovering, it's not just doubling each year or quadrupling, it's like exponentially increasing. And it's reflective of the fact that technology is advancing, our field is gaining lots of knowledge, and it's a great visual to see how the pace of research has really picked up pace. So I'll probably, I shouldn't talk much about genetics, I should leave it to Brian. So I'll turn it over to Brian to kind of go over that.
Sure. No, I absolutely agree with you. I think that, in some ways it parallels research in general, because I think that the last 10 to 15 years has seen us really sort of transition in the research realm, not just in genetics, although genetics has admittedly led the way on this, but across the field of research has transitioned to a much more data-driven approach on things. So really, it's not a case of, well, I'm going to come up with a hypothesis and I'm going to guess, because another word for a synonym for a hypothesis is guess. I'm going to guess how ALS is caused, and then I'll do my experiments to do it. Rather, we will generate all of this data in a really methodical, rigorous manner, and then analyze it so that we're looking across the entire genome or proteome or transcriptome in a rigorous manner at the same level of examination, and see what pops out. So I do think that it sort of reflects a growing trend within the research, this shift towards data-driven science. I also think that there's another revolution that's ongoing at the present time within science, and that is really transitioning to this idea of open science. So what do I mean by open science? Well, one of the issues that we have encountered, and I'm not just saying me, I'm saying everybody up until now, has been this idea that a researcher could spend millions of dollars generating a data set, generating information, and then they publish on it, and they could publish very highly in one of the top journals, but then that information sits on the computer of that researcher and it doesn't really go anywhere. Those are wasted opportunities. So now we're sort of transitioning to this idea of a much more open science field, whereby it's not that you're asked to make that data publicly available. You're actually required to make that data publicly available. And I think that this extends not just to academic researchers, it also extends to pharmaceutical companies, because remember that when they do a clinical trial, they are spending millions and millions of dollars collecting all of this information on patients. And that information, you know, Zach and Jinsey and myself could go back and analyze it in ways that weren't ever envisaged 10 years ago. And but it's not available. But there are efforts now to sort of slowly bring that into, sort of dust off that data and bring it out into the open. So I think that that's really going to be, so it's not just the technology that's driving this sort of acceleration in our research, but it's also this concept of open science. One of the things that we're trying to pioneer here, and it is a bit crazy to be fair, but you know, the NIH has this opportunity to do crazy things. We're actually trying to pioneer this thing whereby our lab notebooks, which is what we write on a day-to-day basis, we actually put them up on the web and have anybody who wants to see them actually have them see them in real time. Another thing that we're trying to pioneer at the moment is that we will generate these data sets. And as we generate them on a sample by sample basis, we will make that data publicly available, and we will not publish on it. We are not there to actually publish on. We are there to generate the best data set that we possibly can, so that we can feed it out to everybody else. And then it sort of acts as a force multiplier that others can actually publish on. So again, this acceleration in research, it's not happening in a vacuum. There are underlying fundamental reasons for it. And I think that overall, that actually gives me a lot of hope for this field. And I think that, you know, 10 years from now, we're going to be looking back at this, at ALS, and go, wow, think about how far we've come in the last 10 years. And I really am, I sort of believe that we're on the cusp of a golden era here. So anyway, sorry, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I like that. I like talking about that.
I appreciate it. I have a couple questions from John Russo, who is living with ALS and has been very involved with ALS research. So there are two different questions, but I'll ask them at the same time. First, would it be valuable to have the whole genome sequence done for every person with ALS living today? And if so, would there be a way to warehouse that data in one location? And also, are you familiar with new legislation HR 7071, which is to provide the acceleration of access to clinical therapies for the treatment of ALS? It's new legislation, so I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. So if you guys can talk about the value of the whole genome sequencing, and also if you know anything about that legislation.
Okay, so I'll deal with the last one first, which is HR 7071. I work for the US federal government, so I better not comment on this. It's not a good idea for me to comment on it. So I'll let Jinsy and Zach comment on it, and then maybe later I can come back and talk a little bit more about the genome sequencing. So over to you guys.
The goal of probably everybody who works in clinical trials and certainly of our patients and their caregivers is access to new treatments. And so I don't think that there's any disagreement at all with regard to the aim of what all of us are after. There's been, you know, on a broad front, a lot of discussion over how best to achieve that. And ideas about that vary a great deal. And the ideas aren't right or wrong, that they just represent different philosophies and different concepts of the government's role versus individual decisions and how access should be obtained. So ideas have varied from, you know, the federal government's traditional expanded access or what we call compassionate use program to legislation such as right to try legislation. And I think that the bottom line goal is always going to be, how does one provide improved access to individuals with a bad disease like ALS? How does one provide access to them for a new drug? How does one balance the safety versus the risks, and who should determine that safety, and who should be determining those risks? What role should the government play, and what role should individuals play in determining that? These are complex arguments, both ethically and medically. I think introducing the legislation and having a discussion about it is an important starting point. And there are going to be disagreements, and legislation is always going to be a compromise. But I think having it there and having the goal of improved access to people for treatments is really critical. I'm glad to see it there.
So this is John Russo speaking. I apologize for the poor phrasing of my question. My question really is more about, is it a good use of $500 million considering the science is where it is right now? I've been a patient for 7 years, and for 7 years I've been hearing we're getting close. Mm-hmm. I've also participated in the ALSRP for the past 4 years, and I see where the preclinical science is. So as human beings and physicians, I would just like to know your personal perspective. Should the money really be spent on research or expanded access or open label extension? Thank you.
So I can go, I guess. I'll take the hot seat. Listen, I think, you know, if there's that much money, you know, a part of me as a person who's facing people who living with the disease, I want to be able to try to figure out what's causing this disease and target a cure for it. So that means an investment in clinical research, or basic science and clinical research, actually, to understand the mechanism and the pathophysiology, and then developing the drug to the right targets to get the best effect, right? So bottom line, you know, I'll personally speak as Jinsy Andrews, just me, the woman who sees a lot of people with ALS. I have to say, if we can advocate for that much money for expanded access, we should be able to advocate for that much money for clinical research. And open label extension is kind of a compromise, I guess, of both perspectives. So it is, I only say open, I only introduce that concept of open label extension because a lot of people are unfamiliar with it. A clinical trial is actually the experiment. So something looks good in a basic lab or preclinically, and then it's brought to human clinical trials and it's developed. So when people living with the disease participate in a clinical trial, and whether they were on treatment or not, at the end, it's just, they don't get anything for their time because it's such an altruistic effort to participate in a clinical trial, right? So if there's anybody who deserves access, sometimes I feel that the people who participated and gave their time should have the first access. And that's usually given through an open label extension. Now, there's a large number of people who want to participate, but because of eligibility criteria, they can't. So I see where the expanded access topic comes into play. And so they want to do something too, because they want to make the community better as well, and they want something for themselves as well. And so there's going to be some give and take between, but like, you know, the big picture here is, okay, expanded access is giving access to a drug that might have some preliminary efficacy, but it may not pan out. Yeah. So where do we want the big money to go? It's to really to understand what's happening with this disease and targeting a drug that we know we won't have to guess whether it works. We'll know it works because we understand why the disease happens. So that's just a very personal. I'm being very transparent and honest. Probably get myself in trouble too, but it's just, you know, that's the big picture. If we can advocate for that much money in expanded access, we should be able to get that for clinical trials too, and basic research.
I mean, I'll give a personal perspective as well, and I think there has to be a balance. I mean, I think that either way you invest your dollars, there's a chance that the investment of those dollars could turn out to be successful or not so successful. You could invest it in basics. You could take the same money and give it to basic scientists and say, okay, now you got a lot, so, you know, go figure this out. And some experiments work and some don't. But yet basic science can't take place in a vacuum. And ultimately you have to bring those things to clinical trials. So it's really not so much it's not a linear process so much as it's a concurrent process. I mean, you can't, you know, and I'm not saying that you are in any way advocating this, but what I am saying is that I think it's tough to step back and ask the question, well, should we be giving this to basic scientists or should we be giving this for expanded access? I don't think we can answer that question. I think that the challenge is that we make little steps. We find things that we think may work. We try them out clinically. We see if they work. We go back to the lab. We say, what have we learned? What else can we figure out? And we go back and bring it back into the clinic. So I think it has to be an iterative back and forth process. You know, ideally, we should have money for both. I agree with Jinsey, you know, and we do need money for both. But I think it's just, I can't see it as an either or kind of thing. And I think it would be nice if Congress could sort of take the broad view and say, you know, let's look at the most broad overall process that we can to mount a successful and effective therapeutic attack on ALS. Where do we put our basic science dollars? Where do we put our clinical dollars? How do we do that? I'm not sure. You know, Congress doesn't always do a great job sorting out complex questions that way. You know, so we'll take what we can, but I think both need to be addressed. That's just me talking. That's not anybody's view.
Thank you. We only have one more question left, and if we are over our scheduled time, and I appreciate people's attention and all the great answers here. And again, if you have questions, feel free to email them to us, anyone here at the chapter, and we'll send them along to researchers. Before I give it to Jeff and Ellen to say some thank you, Jim Coster did send an email question asking, do you know anything about the status of the phase 3 testing of Neurone with ALS?
Yeah, Jinsey, maybe.
Yeah, so what I can say is that phase 3 is still ongoing. There are obviously a number of participants that have completed their entire study time, but there are still people that are ongoing. For the majority of sites they're all US-based sites. They have been able to continue dosing their patients despite the COVID pandemic. And from what I understand, the trial, the last patients should be out by third quarter of this year. So that by the end of this year, we should have a completion of that study. So that's what I understand so far. I hope that helped answer the question.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions at this time. I appreciate everyone's attention and for texting questions into the chat and emailing beforehand. I know that at least one person had asked about slides from the presentations. If you can make sure that they are available to everyone to hear. So Jeff Klein, would you like to say some farewell words, or Ellen Phillips to say thank you?
I'll just do something real briefly and then turn it over to Ellen. I just want everyone to know that in the back of the room, you'll see a display of refreshments. So help yourself. And Ellen, you can send us home.
Ellen, you are still muted, so if you can unmute.
Okay, sorry. Thank you to Brian Traynor, Jinsey Andrews, and Zach Simmons, to Tony for his loyal ability to get through all these things and do a great job with it. The discussion is not over. We've got a lot to talk about and to continue to talk about. I think there was a lot of hope presented today with all the trials that are happening and basic science research too, which is critical. And thank you again to those of you who are on the front lines with our families, especially now with COVID. You're very loyal, and it means so much for patients and for family members and for the public to know what is going on. Thanks again.
Thank you. This concludes our VIP reception. This will be saved and posted on YouTube for people to view later. And we really appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
you.
Thank you.